In the dim silence of early dawn, long before the sun has the courage to rise over the mountains of Jalisco, the city breathes in fear like smoke that refuses to clear. Empty streets glisten under faint street lamps, the air thick with the acrid stench of gasoline, and the hollow rattle of gunfire drifts through alleyways like a cruel lullaby that no one asked to hear. For families hiding behind locked doors, there is no distinction between night and morning anymore. Time has collapsed into one endless blur of dread, where the next bullet could be the one that shatters their window, their home, their lives. To outsiders, it might seem like a story told in headlines or statistics, but here on the ground, fear is not an idea, it is a neighbor, it is a shadow crossing your window, it is the silence of a mother who holds her children close when unfamiliar engines rumble down the street. What was once the sound of a neighbor's footsteps is now the echo of boots that may not leave you in peace. A simple knock at the door, once a gesture of community, now carries the weight of dread. Will it be a friend seeking sugar, or a warning delivered by masked men who decide whether you are allowed to live another day? This is Jalisco, the land once celebrated for its mariachi music, its proud traditions, its harvests of blue agave under the golden sun, but now it is remembered for its smoke-filled nights, its blood-stained streets, and the whispers of a name that chills even the bravest voices, the Jalisco New Generation Cartel. Known as CJNG, they rose from obscurity like a storm unannounced, promising loyalty, disguising themselves as protectors, yet building an empire with tactics so ruthless and systematic that even rival cartels recoiled at the ferocity of their rise. What makes this civil war unlike others is not just the scale of its bloodshed, but the betrayal woven into its fabric. Friends who once shared bread at the same table became executioners standing across from one another. Cousins who carried the same family name found themselves branded as enemies under rival flags. Battles that could have been fought in isolated canyons instead erupted in marketplaces, in crowded city streets, in villages where children once played soccer until sunset. Jalisco became the stage where no place was safe and no moment was ordinary, because when war lives in your home, nowhere remains untouched. But to truly grasp the magnitude of what happened here, we must rewind, peeling back the layers of time to a Mexico where whispers of corruption passed quietly in government offices and small-time traffickers ran their businesses in shadows. Before the name El Mencho became synonymous with terror, before CJNG ruled with iron fists and armored convoys, there was a fragile balance of power held together by fragile alliances. It is within those fragile alliances that betrayal brewed, and from that betrayal emerged a man who would transform a regional cartel into a global menace. In Jalisco, violence has always been more than violence, it has been a language. A torched vehicle left in the middle of a highway is not merely an act of destruction, it is a sentence written in flames, broadcast to anyone daring to oppose them. A body displayed in public is not only a murder, it is punctuation, a brutal reminder of what silence buys and what defiance costs. With every act, CJNG carved its authority deeper into the conscience of its enemies and its own people alike, until terror was no longer an occasional visitor but the permanent tenet of daily life. Yet the civil war that unfolded here was not born in one night of chaos, it was the product of years of strategy, ambition, and betrayal. In quiet corners of the state, men gathered behind closed doors, speaking in hushed voices about power and territory, drawing invisible lines across maps that would soon become visible graves. Smuggled shipments moved like lifeblood through veins that span borders, and every crate, every transaction, every handshake built momentum toward an explosion the world could not ignore. And when it finally erupted, the firestorm was so fierce that even governments scrambled to understand its force. What we unravel tonight is not just the rise of a cartel but the anatomy of a war within itself, a conflict where leaders who once commanded together turned their armies against each other, and where civilians had no choice but to live beneath the crushing weight of violence they did not create. This story belongs to the mothers who waited for their children to return and to the towns that woke up to find themselves turned into battlefields overnight. It belongs to a state that became both the crown jewel and the battlefield of one of the most powerful cartels Mexico has ever seen. But beyond the guns and convoys, beyond the graves and barricades, this story is about ambition, the kind of ambition that swallows entire communities whole. It is about power measured not in votes or laws but in bullets and fear. Every deal struck in secrecy, every life taken in silence, has brought us to this moment where Jalisco stands as both a warning and a lesson to the world. And with each truth we reveal tonight, the veil of secrecy around this civil war will be torn back, exposing the machinery of terror for what it really is. What began as a struggle for control mutated into a civil war that stretched across borders and into the headlines of the world, a war that raised a chilling question: if a cartel can become as powerful as a nation, can it ever truly be defeated? Tonight, we begin a journey into the shadows of Jalisco's bloody civil war, not to sensationalize its horrors, but to understand them. And as we peel back each layer, from origins to betrayals, from alliances to battles, one truth will echo louder than all others: in Jalisco, the war is not history, it is still being written.
You are watching True Crime Cartel Originals. Before we dive into today's story, I've got one small favor to ask. If you love deep, real stories like this, tap the like button, hit subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us which city you're watching from. It helps more than you know, and it allows us to keep bringing you stories no one else dares to tell. Now, let's get into the story.
To understand how the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, today feared as one of the most powerful and violent organizations in the world, came to exist, we must return to the chaotic years when Mexico's drug war was not yet dominated by CJNG, but rather by the shadow of another cartel, the Mencho cartel. In the dusty towns and bustling cities of western Mexico, the Mencho cartel operated as both gatekeepers and middlemen, moving shipments of methamphetamine, marijuana, and cocaine along the arteries of highways that stretched north to the United States. But beneath their apparent control, cracks were forming, cracks born of ambition, betrayal, and the relentless hunger for more power than one cartel could ever hold. Among the men who would eventually exploit those cracks was Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes, a figure whose name would one day inspire the kind of dread reserved for myths and nightmares, but who at that time was just another trafficker trying to survive in a world where alliances shifted like sand. Known simply as El Mencho, he was born into poverty in the countryside of Michoacán, where work in avocado orchards and coffee fields taught him that survival demanded not just sweat, but cunning. His early life was far from glamorous. Humble beginnings, failed dreams, and small-time arrests painted the portrait of a man who could have easily vanished into obscurity, but ambition was the ember that refused to die inside him. In his youth, El Mencho crossed into the United States, chasing a future that never quite materialized. Arrest records in California showed him brushing against the law, caught in petty crimes and drug charges, but these failures hardened him rather than breaking him. By the time he was deported back to Mexico, he carried with him something more dangerous than experience. He carried an understanding of how borders worked, how law enforcement thought, and how the lucrative river of narcotics flowed northward. It was knowledge, not wealth, that armed him in those early years, knowledge that would later prove deadlier than any weapon he could hold in his hands. When he returned to Mexico, El Mencho embedded himself deeper into the Mencho cartel, which at the time served as the Sinaloa cartel's branch in the west, operating under the shadow of the legendary Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. For El Mencho, this was the perfect apprenticeship. The Mencho taught him the machinery of organized crime, how shipments were moved in silence, how money was laundered in plain sight, and how loyalty was both currency and liability. Yet, as he climbed within their ranks, he saw the fragility of the cartel's foundation, built on shifting loyalties and a dangerous dependence on the bigger, hungrier Sinaloa empire. By 2010, the fragile balance shattered. The Mencho cartel fractured into pieces after its leadership was captured, and those pieces did not scatter quietly. Factions splintered, each one desperate to hold on to territory, money, and power. It was in this chaos that El Mencho saw his opportunity. With ruthless calculation, he formed his own faction, one that operated with military precision, swift brutality, and a clarity of purpose that others lacked. At first, they called themselves Los Torcidos, the Twisted Ones, a name that seemed like a warning in a prophecy, foreshadowing the violence that was to come. What separated Los Torcidos, and later CJNG, from the countless other splinter groups that Mexico has seen, was not just their violence, though it was staggering, but their discipline. They were not content with being regional players, they wanted to dominate, to erase the very memory of their rivals, to turn Jalisco into not just a stronghold but the beating heart of an empire. And while other groups relied on corruption in backrooms, El Mencho's men embraced public displays of power, executions staged in daylight, convoys roaring through city streets, and banners hung from bridges announcing their presence as if daring anyone to challenge them. At first, their enemies laughed them off, dismissing Los Torcidos as just another splinter doomed to disappear like smoke in the wind. But their laughter didn't last. Within months, rival factions began to crumble under the weight of coordinated attacks, and entire towns shifted allegiance as fear replaced resistance. With every victory, Los Torcidos tightened their grip, their identity evolving from a splinter group into something larger, something terrifying. Soon, the name Cartel de Jalisco Nueva Generación began to spread, whispered in terrified voices and painted on blood-stained walls, marking the arrival of a new power that refused to hide in shadows. For the people of Jalisco, life became a test of endurance. One day, a town might fly the flag of Sinaloa, the next day it would bow to CJNG, and in between, the streets ran red as families were caught in the crossfire. Businesses shuttered, schools closed, and families fled under the cover of night, abandoning homes that had been passed down for generations. The rise of CJNG was not merely about drugs or money, it was about control so absolute that even silence had to be paid for with obedience. And with each passing month, the once small-time trafficker named El Mencho became a figure of legend, feared as both ghost and executioner. By 2011, the transformation was complete. CJNG announced itself not with press releases or speeches but with blood. In one of their most infamous acts, they left 35 bodies piled under a busy overpass in Veracruz, an unmistakable declaration of war against both rivals and the state itself. The world took notice. Newspapers that once barely mentioned Jalisco now screamed headlines about a new cartel that operated with a ferocity unseen even in Mexico's brutal drug war. The message was clear: CJNG had arrived, and they would not be ignored. This was only the beginning. CJNG was no longer a splinter, no longer a faction fighting for scraps, it was a machine, fueled by ambition, fear, and the relentless vision of El Mencho. In just a few years, they had risen from obscurity to dominance, rewriting the balance of power in Mexico's underworld. But what made them truly terrifying was not just how quickly they grew, but the realization that this was not a group content to coexist with rivals. CJNG was born to conquer, to eliminate, and to expand, and their rise marked the beginning of a civil war that would engulf Jalisco and echo far beyond its borders. Power, once seized, is never easily kept, and for CJNG, the years following their rise became a constant struggle to hold what they had claimed, a struggle not just against rivals but against ghosts within their own house. Betrayal, in the world of cartels, is not a possibility, it is an inevitability, simmering in every alliance, whispering behind every handshake, lingering in every promise of loyalty. For El Mencho, betrayal came first from those who had once been his allies, men who shared his ambition but not his discipline, lieutenants who thought the empire they built together should be theirs to inherit. It was in these moments that CJNG's civil war truly began, not as a single gunfight, but as a slow unraveling of trust, where the line between brother and traitor blurred with every passing day. The first sparks of betrayal ignited in Michoacán, where CJNG's expansion collided head-on with rivals who had once been uneasy partners. Los Viagras, La Familia Michoacana, and remnants of smaller factions rose in defiance, emboldened by whispers that not all of CJNG's men were loyal to El Mencho. Suddenly, gunfire did not just come from enemies across town, it came from former comrades who had once shared their food, their plans, and their blood oaths. These betrayals tore through CJNG's ranks like wildfire, forcing El Mencho to fight not just for dominance but for survival, and proving that the deadliest war is not fought with outsiders but with those who know your secrets. One of the bloodiest chapters unfolded when former CJNG allies turned and carved out their own identity, Cartels Unidos, a loose alliance of enemies bound not by friendship but by mutual hatred of CJNG. In the dead of night, convoys clashed on rural highways, ambushes turned roads into graveyards, and villages became battle zones where entire families were forced to flee with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The betrayal cut deeper than bullets, it showed the world that CJNG's rise was not unchallenged, and that those closest to El Mencho were willing to risk annihilation rather than bow forever. For civilians trapped between these factions, betrayal meant a new kind of terror, one where yesterday's protectors became tomorrow's executioners. Towns once promised safety under CJNG woke up to find themselves under siege by the very men who had once sworn to defend them. A farmer's field, once filled with maize and livestock, became a battlefield littered with shell casings. A schoolyard, once alive with children's laughter, echoed instead with the metallic scream of gunfire. To live in Jalisco during these years was to wake each morning to the same unanswerable question: who do we belong to today? But perhaps the most chilling betrayal of all came not from rival cartels but from within CJNG itself. Commanders who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with El Mencho began to fracture, each believing they deserved a kingdom of their own. Some defected quietly, taking men and weapons with them, while others staged violent coups that drenched towns in blood. Each betrayal carried a message, that loyalty to El Mencho had limits, and that fear, no matter how strong, eventually breaks when ambition whispers louder. And yet, for every betrayal, CJNG answered with vengeance so brutal that even hardened rivals recoiled. Convoys of armored trucks swept through rebel towns like storms, leaving behind burned homes, charred vehicles, and silence broken only by the sobs of survivors. Their brutality was not only punishment, it was theater, a calculated display designed to remind every dissenter that betrayal did not buy freedom, it bought annihilation. In El Mencho's empire, betrayal was not forgiven, and it was never forgotten. This cycle of betrayal and bloodshed did more than fracture CJNG, it reshaped Mexico's entire cartel landscape. Every new splinter group, every fresh alliance, forced the government to confront an enemy that was multiplying faster than it could be contained. Politicians made promises of crackdowns, generals deployed battalions of soldiers, helicopters thundered through the skies, but on the ground, the reality was clear: CJNG's civil war was not weakening them. If anything, the betrayals forged them into something leaner, deadlier, and more determined, as El Mencho tightened his grip on the loyal few who remained by his side. Still, the betrayals cut scars too deep to hide. El Mencho himself vanished from public view, retreating into the mountains, hunted by both rivals and the government, becoming more legend than man. Whispers spread of his presence, one day in Jalisco, another day in Colima, sometimes across borders, but no one could prove his exact location. To his enemies, his disappearance was a sign of weakness. To his followers, it was a sign of strategy, a reminder that their leader was always watching, even if unseen. Betrayal had forced him underground, but from the shadows, his influence grew sharper, deadlier, unstoppable. And as the betrayals mounted, so too did the body count. Families who once placed their faith in a single cartel found themselves broken between factions, their sons recruited, their daughters displaced, their towns turned into front lines. Betrayal became the defining rhythm of Jalisco's life, and blood became the ink with which its history was written. Every defection fueled another massacre, every lie birthed another ambush, and the spiral showed no signs of ending. This was the civil war inside the civil war, a war not just of bullets and bombs but of trust shattered and loyalty bought and sold. What began as a cartel's rise had transformed into a labyrinth of betrayal, each twist drawing Jalisco deeper into chaos. And yet, even as bodies piled and alliances crumbled, one truth remained clear: El Mencho was not finished. In fact, the betrayals only hardened his resolve. If Act 2 was defined by treachery, then Act 3 would be defined by war on a scale Mexico had never seen. By the time betrayal had carved scars deep into the Jalisco New Generation cartel, the stage was set for something far more devastating than scattered ambushes or quiet assassinations. The conflict evolved into outright war, a war where no corner of Jalisco remained untouched, a war where streets, highways, hillsides, and villages became front lines, where the rules of combat vanished and terror was carried out with a precision that made the state itself feel like a battlefield without borders. For the people caught in between, daily life became indistinguishable from wartime survival, with armored convoys roaring past their homes, explosions lighting the night skies, and whispers of looming attacks spreading faster than the news itself. At the heart of this war was a simple, brutal reality: control. Jalisco was not just a home base for CJNG, it was their crown jewel, their fortress, and their message to the world that they were untouchable. To lose Jalisco would be to lose legitimacy, and so the cartel poured everything into defending it. Opposing them was a coalition of enemies, cartels unidos, remnants of La Familia, factions aligned with Sinaloa, each determined to carve out their share of power. Battles erupted not in isolated corners but in broad daylight, in places where children once played, where merchants once sold fruit, where buses once carried workers to their jobs. Now, those same roads ran red, barricaded by burning vehicles and haunted by the echo of gunfire. CJNG's response to these attacks was as calculated as it was terrifying. Entire towns were fortified like military outposts, with gunmen stationed on rooftops, checkpoints set up at every entrance, and armored vehicles prowling the streets as if patrolling occupied territory. But this was not protection for civilians, this was occupation. Every street corner became a symbol of dominance, every roadblock a reminder that CJNG's rule was not negotiated but enforced at the barrel of a gun. Those who resisted were silenced, and those who submitted learned that survival under cartel control meant surrendering not just freedom, but dignity. And yet, even as CJNG entrenched itself, its enemies did not relent. The war escalated into ambushes that stunned the nation, like the infamous 2015 attack on a military convoy, where CJNG fighters unleashed an arsenal of rocket-propelled grenades and automatic rifles, killing soldiers in broad daylight and sending shockwaves through Mexico's government. It was a declaration of power unlike anything seen before, not just a message to rivals but to the entire state, that CJNG was not afraid to confront the military head-on, and that their war was not limited to the underworld but aimed directly at the institutions meant to stop them. The war spilled beyond highways and military clashes, it bled into the daily lives of ordinary families. Markets were abandoned as gunfire erupted without warning, schools were shut down for weeks, entire villages became ghost towns as residents fled with whatever they could carry. For every headline that spoke of a clash or ambush, there were countless untold stories of children left orphaned, of mothers searching for missing sons, of fathers forced into silence under threat of death. In Jalisco, war was no longer something you read about, it was something that lived on your doorstep, something you inhaled with every breath of smoke, something you feared every time an unfamiliar engine echoed down your street. And as the violence escalated, so too did the spectacle of fear. CJNG began employing tactics designed not only to kill but to terrify, armored convoys painted in camouflage, drone attacks dropping explosives, convoys of vehicles flying black flags roaring through cities as if armies of conquest had arrived. For their rivals, these displays were warnings, for civilians, they were nightmares, and for the world watching from afar, they were proof that CJNG had transformed from a cartel into something resembling a paramilitary force, blurring the line between organized crime and insurgency. But even with their power, CJNG was not invincible. Their enemies struck back with ambushes of their own, targeting convoys, assassinating lieutenants, and flooding contested towns with blood. Each side escalated, and each escalation drew Jalisco deeper into the abyss. A single night could see dozens dead, a single week could see hundreds displaced, and the cycle fed itself endlessly, violence creating vengeance, vengeance creating violence, until even the survivors could no longer tell where the war began or when it might ever end. And looming above it all was the figure of El Mencho, unseen, unheard, but always present. His absence from the public eye only deepened his legend, as stories spread of him commanding battles from the mountains, slipping past military raids, and manipulating his enemies like pieces on a chessboard. To his followers, he was a general leading a righteous war, to his enemies, he was a phantom orchestrating chaos. In truth, he was both, a man who understood that in war, visibility is weakness, and invisibility is power. As the war raged on, Jalisco became more than just a battlefield, it became a symbol. For Mexico, it represented the fragility of a nation locked in a conflict where cartels could rival the military. For CJNG, it was proof that they were more than traffickers, they were rulers of territory, conquerors of cities, architects of fear. And for the world beyond, Jalisco's war was a warning, a glimpse into what happens when organized crime evolves beyond crime into something larger, darker, and far harder to contain. But as bloody as this war became, it was not the end, it was only the beginning of something even more dangerous. Because in the heart of every battle, in the shadow of every betrayal, and in the ashes of every burned-out town, a chilling truth was emerging: CJNG's war for Jalisco was not confined to Jalisco at all. Their empire was expanding, their ambitions stretching across borders, their reach growing like wildfire. And as their civil war raged, the world was forced to ask, if Jalisco has already been consumed, who will be next? Once Jalisco had been transformed into both fortress and battlefield, once its soil had been drenched with enough blood to mark it forever, the CJNG did not pause, did not consolidate, did not retreat into shadows like so many cartels before them. Instead, they expanded, stretching their reach outward as if Jalisco were only the first spark of a firestorm meant to consume an entire nation. From Michoacán to Veracruz, from Colima to Guanajuato, the green banners of CJNG began to appear, their convoys rolling through highways, their safe houses multiplying like roots underground, their emissaries striking deals with corrupt officials while their soldiers waged war in the open. Expansion was not an afterthought, it was the plan all along, and with every new territory conquered, the cartel's message grew louder: resistance was futile, surrender was survival, and CJNG's power was no longer regional, it was national. The cartel's rise across Mexico was not limited to battles and assassinations, it was powered by a vast and meticulously engineered economic machine, one that turned ports, highways, and border crossings into arteries of wealth. In Manzanillo, one of the country's most vital Pacific ports, CJNG entrenched itself like a shadow government, controlling the flow of chemicals used to produce methamphetamines, dictating who lived, who traded, and who disappeared. From there, their shipments moved not just across Mexico, but across oceans, containers bound for the United States, Europe, and Asia, filled with product worth billions. It was here that CJNG revealed itself not just as a cartel but as a corporation of violence, one that mastered logistics, supply chains, and the brutal enforcement required to keep them intact. And with this expansion came innovation in violence, because CJNG was not satisfied with the tools of old. Where rivals relied on rifles and pistols, CJNG deployed armored vehicles outfitted with turrets, homemade tanks rolling through streets like specters of a military power gone rogue. Where enemies sent assassins, CJNG sent drones rigged with explosives, hovering above unsuspecting targets before dropping their payload with chilling precision. These acts were not random, they were deliberate displays of dominance, designed to terrify not just their enemies but entire communities, proving that resistance to CJNG was not only deadly but technologically outmatched. In every clash, they blurred the line between cartel and insurgency, creating a form of organized crime that looked less like mafia and more like warfare. As their footprint widened, CJNG made one thing terrifyingly clear: their war was not confined to Mexico's borders. In Central America, emissaries forged alliances and established trafficking routes, spreading influence like tendrils reaching into Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. In the United States, their drugs flooded cities from Los Angeles to Chicago, leaving devastation in the form of overdoses and addiction, while their operatives quietly laundered profits through shell companies and corrupt intermediaries. Even Europe felt their presence, as seizures in Spain and Italy revealed shipments traced back to the same organization whose battles were leaving Mexico in ruins. CJNG's empire was no longer bound by geography, it was a global network, a reminder that in the 21st century, organized crime could operate like a multinational power. But with expansion came enemies, new enemies, stronger enemies. Rival cartels did not sit idly as CJNG devoured territory. In Guanajuato, the Santa Rosa de Lima cartel launched a ferocious defense of its fuel theft empire, turning cities into battlegrounds where car bombs rattled windows and entire police forces vanished overnight. In Michoacán, coalitions of rival groups dug in, deploying their own convoys, their own fortified towns, their own terror campaigns. What followed was less a war between two cartels and more a multi-front conflict stretching across entire states, leaving the Mexican government overwhelmed, underprepared, and often complicit. And yet, CJNG thrived amid the chaos, because chaos was their greatest weapon. While governments hesitated, While rivals bled resources, CJNG grew stronger, feeding on fear and seizing opportunities in the confusion. They infiltrated police departments, bribed politicians, and placed informants within military units, ensuring that every operation against them was compromised before it began. Their strategy was simple: fight when necessary, corrupt whenever possible, and expand at all costs. This relentless adaptability allowed them to survive raids, overcome ambushes, and rebuild after losses that would have crippled lesser organizations. The Mexican people, meanwhile, were left to endure the unimaginable. Expansion meant that violence was no longer limited to cartel strongholds but spread into cities and towns that once felt safe. One month saw explosions in Guadalajara, another saw assassinations in Colima, another saw entire police forces resign overnight after receiving death threats. For ordinary families, CJNG's growth meant an unending state of dread, where the simple act of driving to work or sending a child to school carried the risk of never coming home. Expansion was not only geographic, it was psychological, embedding terror into the very fabric of daily life. Even the government, armed with military resources, struggled to contain CJNG's rise. Time and again, elite units were dispatched into contested regions, only to find themselves ambushed, outgunned, or betrayed by insiders. Entire platoons were wiped out, helicopters shot from the sky, convoys reduced to burning wreckage on mountain roads. Each defeat deepened the perception that CJNG was not just surviving but outmatching the state itself, and that the balance of power in Mexico was shifting toward a cartel that acted like a rival government. Expansion was no longer simply about territory, it was about legitimacy, about proving that CJNG could stand as equals, or even superiors, to the forces of the nation itself. And the legend of El Mencho grew with every expansion, every clash, every rumor of his presence. He became the phantom general of a cartel that seemed to stretch beyond the reach of justice, a man whose name inspired both loyalty and terror, whose survival against countless raids made him almost mythical. As CJNG expanded, so too did his shadow, looming over Mexico like a specter of inevitability. For his followers, expansion was proof of his genius; for his enemies, it was proof of his ruthlessness; and for the world, it was proof that a single man could reshape the map of organized crime. But with expansion came the seeds of something darker, the beginning of fractures, betrayals, and wars that stretched beyond Mexico itself. Because as CJNG planted its flag across new territories and continents, it attracted not only allies but enemies it had never faced before: rival cartels from South America, syndicates from Europe, and governments far more powerful than Mexico's. Expansion brought wealth, influence, and fear, but it also brought exposure. And as the world watched CJNG rise, one question began to echo louder than any gunfire: had they expanded too far, too fast, awakening enemies that even their empire of violence could not withstand? For years, CJNG thrived in the shadows of international indifference, their empire spreading quietly while governments focused on wars in the Middle East, economic collapse, and political instability elsewhere. But empires built on fear cannot remain invisible forever, and soon the world began to take notice of what had been growing inside Mexico. The seizures of methamphetamine in Los Angeles, the discovery of fentanyl networks in Chicago, the cocaine routes intercepted in Spain, all pointed back to the same source, the same name whispered in intelligence briefings, the same phantom leader no one could capture: El Mencho. And suddenly, what had once been considered a regional cartel war was now labeled a global security threat. The world's most powerful nations, long hesitant to intervene in Mexico's internal struggles, now understood that CJNG was not a Mexican cartel, it was a multinational criminal empire, and if it was not confronted, it would keep expanding until it rivaled the reach of entire governments. The United States, always the largest consumer market for cartel drugs, was the first to strike back in earnest. Federal agencies, from the DEA to Homeland Security, began launching massive joint operations designed not just to disrupt shipments, but to dismantle the CJNG network inside American borders. Raids targeted safehouses in Houston, Chicago, and Los Angeles. Bank accounts were frozen, shell companies exposed, and mid-level operatives arrested in coordinated sweeps. But the deeper they dug, the clearer the picture became. CJNG was not an outsider sneaking product across borders, they were embedded in the U.S. economy itself, laundering billions through real estate, trucking companies, and seemingly legitimate businesses. The backlash had begun, but the enemy was far more deeply rooted than anyone wanted to admit. In Europe, too, the backlash grew. Spanish and Italian police uncovered shipments of cocaine and meth hidden in shipping containers traced back to CJNG-controlled ports. Dutch authorities reported the presence of Mexican chemists teaching European crime groups how to synthesize meth at industrial scale. And in the ports of Antwerp and Rotterdam, Europe's gateways for global commerce, seizures skyrocketed, each one larger and more brazen than the last. CJNG was not just supplying Europe, they were embedding themselves in the underworld fabric of the continent, forging alliances with Balkan syndicates, Italian mafias, and even outlaw motorcycle gangs. The backlash in Europe meant mass arrests, massive seizures, and joint task forces, but it also meant that CJNG was now facing enemies as sophisticated, ruthless, and globally connected as themselves. But perhaps the most dangerous backlash came not from governments, but from other cartels, global syndicates who saw CJNG's expansion as a direct threat to their centuries-old empires. In Colombia, whispers spread that paramilitary groups once content to work with Mexican buyers were now turning against them, targeting CJNG emissaries and cutting off supply routes. In Asia, syndicates in China and Southeast Asia, long suppliers of the precursors that fueled Mexico's meth empire, began demanding higher prices, stricter conditions, and in some cases, siding with CJNG's enemies. For the first time in years, CJNG faced the one enemy they could not shoot their way through, competition backed by equally ruthless organizations that operated far from Mexican soil. Inside Mexico, the backlash became visible in the streets. The government, under international pressure, launched a new wave of military operations designed to decapitate CJNG's leadership. Elite Marines stormed safehouses in Guadalajara. Convoys of armored vehicles rolled into rural Jalisco, backed by Black Hawk helicopters circling above. And in every speech, every press conference, the government promised that CJNG's days were numbered. But promises and operations are not the same as victories. Time and again, these offensives ended in ambushes, convoys reduced to wreckage, helicopters shot down by cartel gunmen wielding military-grade weaponry. The backlash was real, but CJNG's resistance was relentless. Every defeat suffered by the government only fed the legend of El Mencho's invincibility. The backlash reached its peak when the U.S. government placed a $10 million bounty on El Mencho, branding him one of the world's most wanted men. His face appeared on wanted posters, FBI bulletins, and news broadcasts across the globe. To Washington, this was the ultimate declaration of war. They would stop at nothing to bring him down. But in Mexico's villages and mountains, the bounty only deepened his myth. Farmers whispered of his presence, locals claimed sightings of him walking through markets, and his men spread stories of him outwitting entire armies. For every manhunt, for every failed raid, his legend grew. The backlash had made him infamous, but infamy only fueled loyalty among those who saw him not as a criminal, but as a folk hero. And still, the global backlash had unintended consequences. As governments cracked down on CJNG's operations, the cartel adapted by fragmenting into smaller, more mobile cells. Instead of collapsing, they became harder to trace, harder to infiltrate, harder to destroy. Each crackdown bred a new mutation of their network, like cutting off the head of a hydra only to see two more grow in its place. International pressure did not stop CJNG, it refined them, forcing them to evolve into something leaner, smarter, and even more dangerous. The backlash was also psychological, a war of narratives. Governments painted CJNG as monsters, criminals, terrorists. But within Mexico, in towns where CJNG provided food, jobs, and protection, the story was different. They were seen as providers, as defenders, as the only force capable of standing up to both rival cartels and corrupt officials who had abandoned the people. This clash of narratives, the world condemning them while locals in some regions embraced them, created a dangerous paradox. The harder the backlash came, the stronger CJNG's grip grew in places where the state had failed. In the core of global opinion, CJNG was an enemy. But in the core of survival, they were often seen as the lesser evil. As the backlash intensified, the question began to shift from whether CJNG could be defeated, to whether it could be contained. Governments realized that eradication was a fantasy, that dismantling an empire with tendrils across continents was nearly impossible. Instead, strategy shifted to damage control, limiting their supply lines, intercepting their shipments, dismantling cells before they spread too far. But CJNG was not merely surviving these measures, they were adapting faster than the world could respond. And as intelligence briefings warned of their reach in Africa, their deals in Asia, and their partnerships in Europe, one chilling realization set in: the backlash was too late. CJNG had already become global. And so, as the backlash raged across borders and governments scrambled to contain what had grown unchecked for too long, the story of CJNG entered its most dangerous phase. Because global backlash does not end empires, it hardens them, isolates them, and forces them to fight with a desperation that knows no bounds. Mencho, hunted by armies, pursued by agencies, cornered by rivals, was still out there, alive, commanding from the shadows. And for every alliance broken, every shipment seized, every battlefield lost, his empire found another way to endure. The world had finally awakened to the monster that had been born in Jalisco, but awakening did not mean victory. It meant only that the final act of this bloody saga was yet to come. There are wars that end with treaties signed in distant capitals, and there are wars that end when the last shot is fired, the last enemy falls, and the dust settles on the battlefield. But the war that began in Jalisco, the war ignited by Mencho and his empire of blood, is not one of them. This is a war with no front lines, no ceasefires, no boundaries. It is a war that bleeds into city streets and boardrooms, that unfolds in jungles and skyscrapers alike. It is a war that seeps into the veins of nations and poisons them from within. And perhaps most unsettling of all, it is a war that cannot end, because every attempt to end it only fuels it further. Today, CJNG remains one of the most powerful and violent criminal organizations on the planet. Despite decades of raids, arrests, sanctions, and military operations, its structure endures, decentralized, adaptive, and deeply embedded in the global economy. Its leadership has shifted, with lieutenants rising and falling, but the system itself persists. Like a virus that mutates faster than the medicine designed to kill it, CJNG has learned to survive in ways that no one anticipated, splitting into autonomous cells that operate independently, building alliances with groups once considered enemies, and diversifying its portfolio far beyond drugs, into extortion, illegal mining, oil theft, and human trafficking. It is no longer merely a cartel, it is a parallel power, a hidden state woven into the fabric of the legitimate world. And still, Mencho remains at large. Decades of pursuit, billions of dollars spent, thousands of arrests, and yet the man who started it all remains a ghost. Some say he lives deep in the mountains of Jalisco, surrounded by a ring of loyal sicarios and civilians who would die before revealing his location. Others claim he has fled Mexico entirely, operating from the shadows of Central America or beyond. There are rumors that he is gravely ill, that he has handed power to his children, that he no longer commands day-to-day operations. But none of it can be confirmed. What is known is this: his name still carries weight. His orders, wherever they originate, still shape the actions of men on 3 continents. And his ghost, whether alive or dead, still haunts the machinery of global organized crime. The Mexican government, for its part, continues to fight, but the nature of that fight has changed. No longer is it just about capturing drug lords or seizing shipments. Now, it is about rebuilding institutions hollowed out by corruption, restoring public trust shattered by decades of violence, and reclaiming territories where the state has long ceased to exist. In many regions, CJNG is the law. They collect taxes, enforce order, and punish disobedience. Entire generations have grown up knowing no other authority. To dismantle that reality would require more than police operations. It would require a complete reimagining of governance itself. And that is a battle no military can win alone. Meanwhile, in the United States and Europe, the demand that fuels the entire machine continues unabated. Despite every crackdown, every campaign, every public awareness effort, the appetite for meth, cocaine, fentanyl, and heroin only grows. And as long as demand exists, supply will follow, because the cartel understands something fundamental about human nature: you cannot legislate desire, and you cannot outlaw addiction. Until that truth changes, CJNG and organizations like it will always find a way back, no matter how many leaders are captured, how many shipments are seized, or how many wars are declared. This is the paradox of the war on drugs, a war that is now over half a century old, a war that has cost trillions of dollars and countless lives, and yet the flow of narcotics remains stronger than ever. CJNG is not the first cartel to rise from the ashes of prohibition, and it will not be the last. History shows that when one empire falls, another rises to take its place. The faces change, the names change, the logos change, but the machinery remains, fueled by greed, desperation, and demand. And in this endless cycle, CJNG stands not as an anomaly, but as an inevitability, the natural outcome of a world that cannot or will not address the roots of the problem. And so the war continues, fought on multiple fronts, with bullets and ballots, with bribes and drones, with intelligence and brutality. It is fought in mountain villages and in cyberspace, in cartel compounds and in courtrooms. It is fought by governments, by rival cartels, by journalists, activists, and the families who refuse to accept that this is simply the way things are. Yet even as it rages on, there is a sobering realization that perhaps this is no longer a war that can be won, at least not in the way we once imagined. Perhaps the most that can be hoped for is containment, mitigation, survival. Perhaps the age of decisive victories is over. And still, amidst all the violence and despair, stories of resistance persist. Communities once paralyzed by fear are rising up, forming self-defense militias to expel the cartels from their lands. Journalists, at unimaginable personal risk, continue to expose corruption and criminality. Families of the disappeared search tirelessly for justice. And international coalitions, slowly but surely, are building new approaches, focusing not just on supply, but on reducing demand, dismantling financial networks, and strengthening the rule of law. These efforts may not yet have turned the tide, but they offer something more powerful than weapons or armies: the possibility of a future where cartels no longer dictate the terms of life and death. Yet even if that future arrives, it will be shaped by the scars of this conflict. Generations have grown up amid bloodshed, children raised to see violence as normal, trust as dangerous, and survival as the only priority. Entire regions have been remade by fear, economies reshaped by illicit money, cultures transformed by the shadow of organized crime. The war against CJNG, and the wars that came before it, have changed Mexico and the world in ways that cannot be undone. And perhaps that is the truest legacy of this conflict, not the bodies or the battles, but the way it has redefined what power, crime, and resistance mean in the modern era. And so we end not with a conclusion, but with a question, one that has no simple answer. How does a war like this end? Does it end with the capture of El Mencho? With the collapse of CJNG? With the legalization of drugs, or the eradication of demand? Or does it simply evolve, reshaping itself into something new, as it has so many times before? The truth is, no one knows. But one thing is certain: somewhere, deep in the mountains of Jalisco, the war still burns. Convoys still move under the cover of night. Deals are still struck in shadowed rooms. And the men who built an empire from blood and fear still watch, still wait, still fight, because the story of Jalisco's bloody cartel war is not over. It never truly was. And perhaps, it never will be. And as this story continues to unfold, one thing is clear: this war is not just Mexico's story, it is the world's. The choices made in faraway capitals, the demands created in distant cities, the silence of those who look away, all of it fuels what happens here. The cartel war in Jalisco is not finished. It is still being written. And the question is not only how it will end, but whether we will have the courage to face it. If you want to understand how deep this conflict goes, if you want the untold stories and the hidden truths the headlines never show, then stay with us. Subscribe to this channel, join this community, and be part of the journey as we uncover the darkest chapters of the modern world, and the forces shaping the one to come. Because the war may never end, but the truth deserves to be told.